The other thing was just a real focus on process. So I think from the beginning, we've understood that process is paramount here. The outcomes are helpful, but if we're not doing it in a trustful way, then we're not going to be successful. And you see here, these are some of the process commitments that we heard through the process in order to do this work, in order to come out the other end of this work in a positive way, we need to maintain a commitment to data justice, a commitment to ongoing community involvement. And I think, as I think about sort of the question of Anti-Racism Data Act and sort of how it intersects with open data, I'm just going to try to use those commitments to let's call it verbally process with everybody here around some of the things that I think we're thinking about. So we, from this point, well, from a few months back forward, have a requirement to publish statistics every single year on the work that we're doing. And those research priorities are driving that work, but those research priorities are not exclusive necessarily. Really what we need to start doing is publishing the research that we've done. Part of that is really what information are we putting out around systemic racism within government programs and services? What information can we put out that really helps people understand the inequities that exist within our programs and services today? So I think as we do that, sort of, I think we know that open data is going to be part of that, but we also really want to think through those process commitments. So there's a couple, like just thinking firstly about Indigenous data governance. We have published open data for years about Indigenous people without ever asking them necessarily. And this is obviously not right. I think at a summit a number of years ago, one of my colleagues got asked this question, and I think that moment for me was a moment where I think we started asking the question of, there's a pursuit here, but have we brought everybody else along on that pursuit? And have we involved people that have rights around their information in the fact that their information is being posted? I still, and I appreciate the positive reasons behind some of these things. We as a government published on our front page sort of a deficit narrative about Indigenous people graduating at a lower rate than or the rest of the population within the BC K-12 system. Without context, without the information around the different school districts, without necessarily a narrative to really tie back. So tie back to the fact that the schools were not built necessarily for Indigenous people. So I think we as a government, as we think through releasing this information, we need to continue to think through, are we releasing information that is within our control? Have we actually thought through and asked Indigenous people whether or not we should release this information? We have a commitment under the Declaration Act to work with Indigenous people on a regional information governance center where they have the information and we give it back to them, and maybe if they want to release it as open data, that would be their prerogative. I don't consider it our prerogative to release open data about Indigenous people. And my policy and ledge team can tell me if I'm wrong on that. So that's something that we're considering and just trying to understand how we work in this space on a go-forward basis. I think on data justice, and I will be fully transparent, I am not an expert in data justice and had to Google it, I don't know, 3 times in the last 3 months, every single time it comes up. So what I will say is what I've heard from our committee, and that is really thinking through how the data benefits communities. And for us, as we think about research priorities and producing statistics and producing open data, we really need to ask ourselves the question of how releasing this information is benefiting the communities that it's about. How does the research advance the interests of Indigenous people and racialized communities? And I think this is something that we're grappling with, and I don't know that we have an answer to, but I think there's value in us understanding that open data is helpful for some. Some element of putting value-added information beyond just open data is going to be very, very helpful for communities. We asked, I think, 5 community-level organizations before this discussion whether or not they'd used open data, and they hadn't. And I think that's unfortunate, because I think it's an opportunity for them to have the information around what programs and services work, to have information around how their communities are using government programs and services. But I think we need to make it a little bit more accessible and usable for them. Intersectionality. So this commitment goes to the fact that we've had limited demographic information in everything that we've released to date. I think that there's an opportunity for us with this survey to really, really think through how we give better information around the various identities that people have in order to understand how intersectional, how some of the interactions with government services are experienced differently by different folks. Last 2, so community involvement. I think we have always undertaken work as a government around producing research about people. I think where we are moving to is producing research with people. We've spent the last, I think, 3 meetings with our anti-racism data committee, really talking through some aspects of how we govern the survey information, but more than anything, what we've heard is an overwhelming desire for people to be involved. If we are going to produce information about how different communities interact with labor market programs, we need to involve those communities before we draw conclusions that really we start telling everybody about. And the last one is intersectionality again. It's actually transparency. So Microsoft Teams is awesome. So I think there's a couple things that I'll flag here. So one of them is, and I'm stealing the words from one of our committee members, relational accountability is critical here. So the more that we are very, very clear on the research we're doing, the outputs of that research, who was involved, almost the metadata of the research project itself, in order to ensure that there's utter transparency in the work that we're doing. We also need to make sure that transparency comes with context. So we're explaining how programs and services were built in the first place, and how many of them were built to exclude people is really important context when we're releasing research information. And then I'll come back to that piece around, I think we have an opportunity to really think through how we make this information accessible for a broader group of people. Ultimately, I would love those 5 community organizations to be using our data, to be using our research and our information to come back and push government to do better in those services, to push government to improve the way that the services are built, and in order for those community organizations to really think, to be able to apply for grants with better information than what they have today. So, as I said, those are my verbal processing thoughts on how I think this work sort of can evolve into an open data space, acknowledging that whatever we do, it needs to be done with communities, and it needs to be done with Indigenous people. That's everyone. I'm happy to take questions if anybody has any, but I'm probably ahead.
Anybody? Oh.
As you're collecting data, wow, that's loud. As you're collecting data and you're doing the surveys across different communities, you're at 205,000. We have over 4 million people in BC. How are you taking that data and applying it into changing service design and service delivery? Because that is the outcome based on what I'm hearing.
Yeah. So like first off, 200,000 seems like small when we have, 5 million people in this province, and it's a way bigger sample size than we normally work with when we're building and changing programs and services. For us, ultimately, this could be a 3-step dance. This could be a 10-step dance. I think it comes down to this information will help us really look at a program like the K-12 system and identify, which communities are getting good outcomes, which communities are not. Is there a difference between school district X and school district Y? And it really opens up the opportunity for us to dig into that next step. We need to go into school district Y and say, why are kids of African descent not doing well in this school? I think that there's a whole other conversation around like thinking about the quantitative and the qualitative information that you collect at that stage. I think the findings also lead you into a whole other process of like, now you have a lot better information to start to undertake that program analysis and to start to undertake service design, and who needs to be involved in that service design in order to build better services on a go-forward basis. So I think my team hates it when I use the word triage, so I'm going to avoid the word triage. Really, this is an opportunity for us to look at a system and then dive deeper in and start to actually figure out that next level of information. We as a government have pretty good history on this, more on the discrimination and human rights side, where there's a sort of standard process for us understanding how and when discrimination has occurred. We don't have that set process necessarily for racism and systemic racism, and that's what we're trying to learn as much as we can from the discrimination side in order to better understand how to dig in deeper.
Thank you. Anybody else? Oh, I do have one from the online chat as well. Are you exploring releasing data from communities on the BC Open Data Portal as a way to support broader use?
That's a really interesting question. And I think one of the things that we know is that we have a whole bunch of information and it's not a complete picture. So I think for all of the work that we've done, we've pulled together roughly 80 different reports from community level organizations to help inform our own priorities, and would greatly value sort of continuing to have those partnerships with community organizations. I can't tell you whether or not we can actually incorporate it into the data catalog. Sunil can tell you that tomorrow when he briefs everybody, but certainly I think our openness to partnering is immense. I think we have a question over here as well.
Perfect, thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentation. It was great, and I really enjoy your slides. I'm from a community organization in Calgary. I actually would be curious if there's any other community organizations here, because it does seem very systems government focused. And I represent an organization that supports immigrants and refugees, so that's the lens that I'm bringing. I'm always curious, personally and professionally, around how you ensure or if your anti-racism committee had any guidance on how to ensure the cultural safety in your data collection cycle, and everything you're saying in terms of like how it affects programs and services, how you're collecting data, how you're reaching those populations that can't be seen, say refugee claimants, individuals with no status. Like, how does the cultural safety lens apply to your whole process?
Yeah. Incredibly hard question. Thank you. But I will say, first off, I don't think we've really considered it that much in the past. I don't think it's something, I think that there's so much that we have to learn from the academic community, from the community level organization, community level organizations on how to collect this information in a safe way. We have commitments around how to collect culturally safe information, and you heard about even the concepts around gender data collection and really asking government whether or not they need this information in the first place is one of the things that I'm trying to bring into this work as well, is not the question, but just being conscious of A, do we need to collect this information? B, how do we collect this information, recognizing that different communities are going to have different trust levels with government themselves collecting information. And to be perfectly honest, we saw this in the survey where we had really good response rates, but certain communities were not responding to the survey, and we needed to pivot and figure out different ways. For instance, we ended up having to actually put folks down into communities with iPads, with language, in order to do this. Turns out, community organizations have been doing this for decades, but it's not something that we in Victoria are well seasoned in. So I think that that's an area that we know. The other aspect is we know there's immense gaps here. We know that certain communities are not necessarily, don't have access to necessarily a home address where they would have got this letter. Certain communities, we did it in 15 languages, but there's, hundreds of languages spoken in this province. So we know that there are gaps in this, and we need to make sure that those are really crystal clear when we're communicating on research, is just that these are preliminary steps. These are our early indications of what it is that we know, but we have not filled all the information out.
Thank you. I have a question about lessons learned from your research that could be applied to local governments providing services. I'm an emergency manager, and we provide a lot of services to folks when they're most vulnerable during an evacuation. How could you take the lessons learned that over your research and the policies and programs you put together, and advice for local governments who may not be at the same level that your BC government is looking to be at when it comes to anti-racism?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question and kind of acutely important right now. I think for us, there's a couple things I'd say. One of them is just the question of, I'm sure this has been said before, minimum viable data. What is the critical information that you need in order to actually provide the service itself or provide the research itself? And I know I'm the person that just stood up here and told you about a survey that we did that was supplementary to a StatCan survey necessarily, but just acknowledging that, especially in a crisis, people want to move quickly and want to give as little information as possible in order to get the service. The other thing I would say is just information architecture is kind of critical here. So the ability to make your information findable. I think from our survey, the survey and data collection activity itself, it was an immense uplift in making sure that the information was available, accessible, available in 15 languages. Like the entire survey was available in 15 languages, and that was like a huge learning for us on how we undertake something like that when we're coordinating across all of the languages themselves. I'd also say that in 5 or 10 minutes, I'll have like 7 more ideas for you, so maybe just come and talk to me afterwards.
Maybe one more. We started a tiny bit late.
Thank you. I'm from the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples. I have a quick comment and a question. Comment, I commend you for Government of British Columbia for implementing UNDRIP, okay, and I hope that the other provinces will follow suit, okay. I'm really also happy that you're doing the survey on racism and anti-racism, because speaking of Stats Canada, we don't have really, census doesn't have a question on racism, for example, direct question. I mean, the closest one is the Indigenous People Survey, which is coming next year. So I'm really happy to see that you're doing this. Now, speaking of intersectionalities and data sovereignty, etc., I'm just wondering if you, in your analytical strategy, you took into consideration Indigenous identities that includes also off-reserve Indigenous peoples, for example, status, non-status identities as part of the design, because I think that's an important indigenous identity intersectionality that can be crossed with, many important other factors, right, or other variables. And on the qualitative and quantitative side, I know it's a big sample, 250,000, but I'm wondering if you also thought about having some open-ended questions. From our experience, because of the problems with the current instruments, undercounting really the needs of the indigenous peoples, we resorted to primary data analysis, so designed our own. So with open-ended questions, I think it provides important insights about the experiences of the indigenous peoples are not otherwise captured by the Western designed conceptualizations and methodologies.
Yeah, just sort of working backwards, and I will admit, and I will point you to a few folks at this table here that could dig into this a little bit with you. I'm looking strictly at you, Farah. But really, there are a number of open-ended questions. I think this is what we're digging into right now. And some of those were around people's culture and acknowledging that it was really difficult to put specific set of variables with regards to the word culture. But I would encourage talking to Farah here because she got to work on that and is now doing all the post-survey coding work. And then with regards to Indigenous identity, yes, and the survey logic kind of drove you down into various aspects of identity for Indigenous people, including it being distinctions based between First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. And then, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, there's an additional layer of questions around on-off